Hey, so in the previous video we implemented this stack data structure with TDD. Now we will extend this implementation by 3 additional methods. So now we'll add 3 new methods to the stack. They are quite easy to implement. Actually, they're easier to implement than the push and pop methods. We will implement a peek, which basically returns the most recently pushed item without eliminating it from the stack. Sometimes it's quite useful if we want to just know what we pushed onto the stack without changing the stack. In some algorithms, in some applications of the stack, this is very useful. It is also very useful to have the method called size, and for the sake of keeping our code clean, we can also add a method called isEmpty. I know instead of isEmpty, we could just check if the size is equal to 0, but I think it's cleaner to have a separate method called isEmpty. So let's try to write some tests. We already have these tests, which I would call test of pushing and popping, right? So push and pop are the tests that we wrote before. Okay. Let me clean it. It should still work. Now we are going to add the first test for peeking. So let's peek. At the last pushed element. So again, if we didn't push any element, we should probably throw the same error, right? The error of stack underflow. So instead of pop, let's do peek, and we expect this to throw an error. Okay, we have stack.peek is not a function. Again, we didn't implement this function yet. Let's implement it, and this should do something very similar. We should actually do this. Well, actually, our test is only about this for now. So let's keep it simple. Let's see if it works. If it works, it's amazing. Let's add another test for peeking, which will be, whoops, let me copy all the tests. And when we push an element and then we peek at the element, we want this to be equal 11. It's not. This should still be quite simple to implement, I would say. Probably you can copy just this part of the code. We will not modify the stack, so we can remove this thing. And this is, yes, this is still working. We could simplify it, so maybe we could just return this instead of having 2 lines of code. And it works, amazing. We could also have a look what happens if we push a few items. In this case, we want to peek at the last, the most recently added item, which is 13. Let's see if it works. It works. So I would say this, we just wrote a test. I cannot come up with a test which could fail now, so I would say this method is done. Now, let's try to implement the method called size. Again, what happens if we check the size of an empty stack? Should we throw an error? Probably not. Yeah, if we check the size of an empty stack, we should just return 0, right? So this should be, we don't need an error function anymore. The size of an empty stack should be 0, exactly. So let's go back. Okay, this is failing because the size function is not implemented yet. So let's implement it. And let's return 0. Great, it works. So let's see what happens if we push an element onto the stack. Let's say we push an element 19 and we want the size to be equal 1. Again, I would say the simplest thing to do would be to check if item, well, this, to be popped, if it exists, then we return 1. If not, we return 0. This would be very TDD driven, as you can see. But this test would fail if I add another test. Let's say if I push number 23, I should get size number 2. Now I can see that I didn't rename my tests, so let's quickly rename them. It throws when the stack is empty. It returns it peak. It returns the only element in the stack, and it returns the last element in the stack. The last, well, the most recently added element. Here size returns 0 for empty stack, returns 1 for stack with 1 element, and it should return 2 for stack with 2 elements. Okay, so what we could do here is to actually write an if, something like if this to be popped exists, and this to be popped next to be popped exists, we return 2. Let's see if it works. This is I'm forcing it a bit, but let's write another test which would look like it returns 3 for stack with 3 elements. So let's return 20, let's push 29 additionally, and we want to return 3. And as you can see, it's growing, and we have a very complicated loop here next to be popped. So this is getting a bit out of hand. I would say that instead of this, we could come up with a smarter way of somehow saving the size. So we have to think about when the size can change. The size can change only when we use the pop method and push method. We always push exactly 1 element. There's no limitation to that. So maybe we could just do something like, you know, maybe there could be an internal size variable which we could, well, increment when pushing. And the same for peaking. We could just decrement the size. Here we have our stack is complaining, WebStorm is complaining that attempt to assign to constant or read-only variable. Why is that? Because we did not define the size variable yet. So again, the goal is to get rid of this complicated logic in the size method and track the size while pushing and popping. But here we have the problem with the size. This is probably because we would have to assign something to this variable first. And we could do it in the constructor. When the stack is empty, the stack's size is 0. Okay, here we have another problem. Still complaining. What's that now? This size equals 0. Let's do it this way. Okay. This does not work still, but we actually wanted to re-implement this method. Let me comment this for a second and just return this size. Will it work? It says that this stack size is not a function, interestingly. Cool. It seems like we have a problem with naming. So let's rename this to, we'll rename it into size underscore size, which not as much in JavaScript as in Python. Underscore size would mean that this is an internal variable that we should not use. And yes, it works. This is cool. So look, we can remove all of that, and we have our size method implemented already. And lastly, we'll implement the method for is empty. Returns true for empty stack. Let me delete some of these tests. Let me comment this one, and or actually we'll remove this one as well. So it should return true when the stack is empty. And again, it will probably fail because we didn't even implement this function yet. So let's implement it, just return true. Okay, it works, but does it work if we push an element to it? This should be false. And it's still failing. Okay, so as you can see, we could make both tests work just by returning this size equals to 0. This is basically the condition for is empty. So here we go. We have finally written, implemented the full stack API with 5 methods: push, pop, peek, size, and is empty. In the next video, we will have a look at how stacks could be used for some cool algorithmic 3Ds or in other applications. So this is it. We have our stack implemented with TDD, and see you in the next video.